That map over on the right are all the different decisions that need to be made on the permitting side. All of those decisions are all lightning rods for litigation. Those are the things that we try and speed up. 63 environmental laws, most of which were written before the internet. Rivers and Harbors Act of 1910 still governs a permit. I was on the phone today. The Endangered Species Act 1970, Clean Water Act 1975. Most of the laws that still govern infrastructure today, again, invented 40, 50 years before the internet, and we're still using those rules today because Republicans and Democrats don't trust each other. They see ghosts in what both are trying to achieve, and it is very difficult to arrive at compromise, so the status quo prevails. And do you know who gets the front end of the stick? The ratepayers, who look at this complicated process and say, gee whiz, I hope the public officials we put in office have our best interest in mind. But because the projects are 5 to 7 to 10 years in investment horizons, the state legislators that are in office, the mayors, the governors today, are going to be retired 5, 6, 7 years from now when the project is actually breaking ground. So it's really hard to get the incentives of why action now saves us millions and millions of dollars 4 to 5 years from now. Why should I care? As I pointed out at the very beginning of this, every one of these sectors, conventional energy, mining, water resources, electricity transmission, broadband, ports and waterways, manufacturing, Clean Water Act, and then all of it, that's pumps and pipes, the underwater system, and transportation. You can't distinguish between what changes to the laws and regulations that we have to fix one sector over another. They all have the same fate, and right now, they all take 5 to 7 years to build. Unnecessary permitting delays that have nothing to do with environmental protection, protecting First Nations, Indigenous people, environmental justice, community impacts, you name it. We can streamline the system without impacting all of those. And anyone else that says the contrary, I'd like you to come up to the stage and debate them right now. The other thing that doesn't help is the whims of election cycles. What we have right now is everybody that takes over a particular office, as soon as Biden took over, he upended everything that President Trump did. The next president that wins will upend everything their predecessor did. And that regulatory whiplash wreaks havoc on project developers who don't care about politics, they just want to build the project. We have 274 new regulations that have happened in the last 24 months across all agencies on how much water you can use. What is the waste assimilation? I'm giving it into the Snake River if we're going to have a mining project with a new tailing facility, or like maybe it's a stormwater overflow from a new road or transit project. How can you adequately inoculate from risk in building a project if the rules keep changing? Let's go to one of the things that you can do, which is a big deal, and why we're traveling around the country, and something that I want to get into in a little bit. You can't control what Senator Crabo or what Senator Murray or other folks, or Senator Berkeley rather, a couple others, what's going to happen in DC is going to happen. Not asking you to go lobby and say we need a faster process. Everyone agrees on the what. We want a faster process with less obstacles, that is less complicated, so that the average Joe, so I can explain it to my mother, why a project is taking so long, and why we have to go get more tax revenue and get more bonding authority for a 20 to 30% cost escalation for a project that is completely avoidable. States gearing up these state permitting councils, which is an online dashboard, so that the projects are transparent, there's a predictable path. You don't like the project, that's great. Go through regular order, register your comments, and we can adjudicate those in real time. Most of the projects that are moving through the system at the state and federal level, and I'm talking about $4.5 trillion worth of projects split across 800 right now, active projects in the pipeline. Mining, wind, solar, pump storage, port expansion projects, you name it. We have no insight to where they are in the process. There's no central repository. It's all happening in the black box. At the state level, you have a transparent dashboard that shows what projects are moving through the system, and you can actually count on those decisions being made in an appropriate amount of time beyond the next gubernatorial election and the next state house election. I'll get into that in a little bit, but the important thing is we've never had an opportunity like we've had in the last 2 years, 3 years, to make real change. And those that continue to argue legacy talking points, whether it be the Nature Conservancy and the National Resources Defense Council fighting against Idaho Power and NextEra Wind and Solar, talking about how the developers don't have the environmental impacts in mind when they're doing these projects, are scared because in many ways, this machine that we call America actually needs about 50 gigawatts of new electricity in the next 20 years, which is 50 nuke plants, and we just are not going to get there. We don't build the semiconductors and the battery storage facilities that we need, and since 90% of our critical minerals are coming from Indonesia, Malaysia, and China, we have no domestic sourcing for our critical minerals. This isn't a Republican or Democrat idea. We can build a mine safer than anywhere else in the world. I'm talking about Canada and the US combined, yet we don't. Congress cannot get out of its own way. States is laboratory for change. If you take the leadership role, that's really going to make the difference. So, again, with that, I'll turn it over to Stuart, back to Bruce.
I've got some slides coming up here. You know, these issues are really the same on the other side of the border as well. We're experiencing them at the same time in some different ways. I think there's a determination to find ways through it, through the legislative systems we have. In Canada, it's a somewhat different picture. There was a new study out this morning from the Public Policy Forum that says we need in Canada to double or even triple the amount of electricity infrastructure for the projected targets. How are you going to do that if you cannot permit things? This is the obvious question here. Just a quick word about what I'm doing here. I have attended PNWER for over a couple of decades, not everyone, but I've been to so many different places. It's always been a thing I look forward to because it's where these minds come together in a more relaxed setting, and I've made so many friends here. The ResourceWorks team is here as well because we're going to be hosts in British Columbia. We're really excited about that next year. A couple things we do in ResourceWorks. We're an independent not-for-profit. We have, during the COVID years, we did a task force on building real jobs, real recovery, what was needed to come from COVID. This was a national study. We have been working for the last 4 years to deliver an event called the Indigenous Partnerships Success Showcase, which in the UNDRIP era, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it's a whole new ballgame in Canada and British Columbia. And so we've been bringing the stories of this change to our stage so that those who want to learn from them can see real examples. And we do this every June in Vancouver. The fifth one is a year from now almost. There was a term I heard for the first time last year, pancaking. This is the effect of just stacking up new regulations on top of the old ones rather than taking a pause to remake things that you don't want. And I think this is a widespread phenomenon. People, you probably immediately recognize the significance of this, and you've seen it yourself. Interestingly, the example here is a stack of pancakes in the oil and gas sector. And this particular term, the first time I heard it was from an environmental advocate from the Pembina Institute. So this isn't, just the oil and gas industry complaining about things. It has all kinds of consequences for everyone who's part of this shared journey. And we see it all over the place. So it's one of the prevailing things that I hear in my conversations with industry and government. Let's move this down so it's a little more even. We like to compare ourselves to the US, and I think often for the US, a comparison to Canada is apropos of the situation. Looking at this particular metric, the US looks like it's doing all right, but from what I've heard here, there's not a lot of happiness with the state of the business setting as pertains to permitting. We've got the same logjams, backlogs as we do, and I think there is a sense of, in Canada, in investment and industry, that we have so many roadblocks to projects moving forward. I don't think in this group there's any disagreement about this, but this is one window into it. I'm not going to dive deep into any of these. I want to skip over very quickly because I think the conversation on stage will be really the good part of this. And you know, I promised to not be the stereotype Canadian. I'm not going to be polite. I'm sorry, but I won't apologize for anything. Except, I'm sorry, just apologize. But can't help it. Critical minerals, you know, right now, since the infrastructure, or was it the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, came through, there has been, to paraphrase the great Ross Perot, there's been a giant sucking sound that we're hearing in Canada, and that's developers of clean projects that are saying, hey, the action is in the States because of that, what is it, $400 million on the table. And so there's been, I think, a pretty quick-witted adaptation to be more competitive in Canada. There's a sense, almost, I don't know, of panic in Ottawa that we could be losing important opportunities to develop our economy in all the right ways for the era we're in. And we have to get our house in order to allow those critical mineral projects to be developed quickly. Now, I think in the USA, you've got, also you're hearing a giant second sound, and that's China taking opportunities in critical minerals around the world. And so we're both experiencing this, and I don't say this, I don't think anyone in Canada is resentful of what the US is doing, but the message to Ottawa that I keep hearing about is, you know, we need to match this in our policies. That's all we have to do, so we have a competitive, you know, as they say, a level playing field. That's all we want in industry. Hear that over and over again. Just an interesting thing, I think it's more pertinent to the particular geography of British Columbia. Our First Nations there have relatively few treaties in effect, and this means that there's a lot of uncertainty. It's driven by jurisprudence and increasingly practice, people working things out. And I referenced the UNDRIP law. In 2019, the BC legislature passed what I believe is the world's first UNDRIP law, Bill 41, which set down that UNDRIP principles are to be implemented into our legislative framework. Not overnight, it'll take probably decades. And the first industry through this was going to be forestry, and I think it has happened. And so one thing that's happening here in permitting terms is a shift of who's doing the work of permitting to local First Nations. So it's a really interesting time right now as you see, I think there's some capacity gaps in First Nations, especially small ones, having the administrative tools to be able to engage in the things they're being asked to do, but we're also seeing that in oil and gas. BC's case, of course, is mostly gas and the upstream. We've had developments in jurisprudence there that I think caused industry to take a deep breath and say, are we going to be standing after this? But you know what, working things out. There's one little piece of innovation that I think is coming out of BC. I don't see it. You know, when I Google, I don't see this term being used in a lot of other places. Intentions paper. You know, so the government is saying, okay, we're going to go through some reforms here, but before we do that, we're going to do that grander piece to set the stage for it. We're going to set out the intentions that we think we as government and those stakeholders and rights holders we're consulting with are interested in hearing about. And I think that's a piece of innovation that arguably hasn't yet shown you know, the ultimate goal, but I think maybe in the right direction. So I'll close by saying that through working creatively, through moving to higher levels to escape the conflicts that can bog us down and slow things down, we can thereby accomplish these higher level aims of getting more mines for critical minerals, getting the cleaner energy products to the world's markets who are looking for them, who are turning to high quality and democracy-based products for their own economies on wherever it may be across the oceans in the world. So those are my thoughts to close, and I'll take my seat.
We're a little short on time, and I've just been kind of looking at these questions and try to bundle them. If we're serious about a North American energy security process and coordinated integrated system, and you'd mentioned Keystone Pipeline before, and I know when corridors cross over international boundaries in our country, we